for his family. There's no mention of the tabernacle or the temple or anything such as that, and there's just several other reasons, but why we believe this was going on. So Job takes place in the land of Uz. We don't know exactly where Uz is, but we know that it's east. It's to the east, and so anytime you see a reference in the Bible to a place, when it gives direction like that, east would mean to east of Jerusalem. East of Jerusalem. So somewhere to the east of Jerusalem is where this is taking place, this story is. And it is considered a book of poetry, so that's why you find it grouped in that grouping of stories with Psalms and Proverbs and that sort of thing. Right after the book of Esther is where you'll see it at in the Bible. So I want to talk just a little bit about the baseline of the story, which is as it being a book of poetry, lots of symbolism, lots of things going on in the book of Job. We see this as a book that talks about pain and suffering and loss and is God good? You know, the world has got a lot of trouble in it. How can there be a good God in a world where there's so much wrong going on? And so we see a little bit of that. We see how that we can react to mourning and loss and suffering ourselves. What a wonderful book it is. A book that will strengthen and encourage our faith. Job was a wealthy man. We see when we read about Job, he was blameless and upright before the Lord. He was a man of great integrity. And in fact, the day that the devil shows up, he walks in with the sons of God into heaven. Remember, the devil was one of those. He was familiar with that area. He comes walking in with the sons of God into heaven, and God says, "Where have you been?" He said, "I've been walking to and fro up and down upon the earth." And this is where this comes about. We look at this story, and you'll think of this. And I get a lot of my information from John Ortberg wrote on this. I really like the way he put most of this. But you know, we think of it as, it looks like a cosmic wager, some sort of weird cosmic wager between Satan and God. But that's really not what's going on here. And I want to point out what really is happening. We'll see as the story progresses. But he tells the devil, "Have you considered this blameless and upright man, this great representative that I have for the human race in Job? Have you taken a look at him?" And the devil says here, you know, his whole story is the devil thinks that this covenant that we have, this covenant love, covenant relationship that God has established with Abraham and with the human race, he thinks it's all a joke. And he says it's a joke. And you've heard me say it before, but it's kind of like he says it's like you're giving him this stuff. So if you would turn off the faucet of blessing, then see how quick he turns off his faucet of devotion to you, God. He's in this because he's getting something out of it. You protect him. You put a hedge of protection around him and all of his possessions. You've blessed him with all this abundance. Of course he loves you, and that's the reason why. So the devil's kind of like, almost acts like a prosecuting attorney here. And the challenge is made, and God says, "All right, I'll let you. We'll let you have this way with Job, and we'll see what happens." Here's the way Ortberg describes it, and I like, is that when we look at the book of Job, I want you to think of it like this. This is my great artistic drawing here. So this is a stage. I don't know if you can see it. So think of it as like a play. And in this play, here's where we would be sitting. This is the audience seating, and there's the stage right here. But then also on risers up above, there's a secondary stage up high. And so as we're sitting out here, we get to watch these events taking place. As the reader of the book of Job, you're watching this. But up here, this is heaven. Okay, so we can see what's going on in heaven. And we can see what's going on earth. But just keep in mind that the ones in heaven can see what's going on earth. But these guys here can't see what's happening above. We as the reader get to see both places as well and see everything that's going on. So what we see in scene 1 is after this little thing takes place between God and Satan, Satan exits this upper stage and comes to the lower stage. When he comes to the lower stage, we see Job lose everything, don't we, in a day. Literally, while one servant runs to him and says, "The Sabians have fallen on us, or your servants have been killed, your camels have been stolen." The next one comes running in and says, "You know, all your kids have died. You know, a great wind blew and the house collapsed and they died." And, Job had prayed for his kids every single day, or every time they had one of these parties, they would get together and they partied too much, it looked like, and he would pray unless one of them might happen to sin against God. And he cared for his kids, and he found out on the same day that all the things that he had, all his wealth, his possessions, his children, his animals, his servants, all but a few, had all been killed. And what is his response in that? I've talked about it recently in a sermon. I said, he literally... He fell down, he shaved his head, he fell down in mourning. He was very upset, of course, but then he still worshiped God. And so he said, naked I came in the world, naked I'll leave. And he says, God gives, God takes away. He kind of takes it like that. And so in this, the Bible says he did not sin. He withheld his integrity. And so what we have is, after seeing this, we have seen too, Satan back up top again, comes in to talk to God. And he basically, there's a little talk there about this, and God says, well, did you notice? Did you see how just this man acted? And Satan says, well, it's because you didn't allow me to touch his body. Now, if I touched his body, I know he cares about his stuff, but when you get a hold of somebody with a great sickness or illness or pain, torture, whatever it might be, then they'll quit. And so God allows this to happen. So Satan exits the upper stage, goes to the lower stage again, and this time we see Job end up with these sores, these boils all over his body. There's been doctors that have tried to, from the reading, describe what they think he had, and it's a horrific disease. Well, there's 2 or 3 diseases they think it might have been, and any of them are super painful, horrible. And we find Job now sitting in an ash heap. Basically, he's out where everybody throws the ashes from the fire and their refuse and the trash. It's the junk heap. He's out there laying in this ash heap, sores literally on the bottoms of his feet. Can you imagine? Boils all the way to the top of his head, and he's scraping it with a broken piece of pottery he's found there in the trash heap that he's sitting in. This is the wealthiest man there was in the East. Had it all, had blessing of God, everything. And then just in a couple of time here, a couple of days, where he's just, everything is lost. And we know his wife comes out and says, are you still staying in your integrity? Why don't you curse God and die? And we're hard on the wife, and I've said this many times, but imagine, she lost everything too. She lost everything she had as well. But anyways, in this, where it goes from here is 3 of his friends show up. 3 of his friends show up. And when his 3 friends show up, they are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. I wrote them down here. And when they show up, the Bible says they see Job from a distance, and they don't even recognize who he is. He's just so different, and they can see how much pain he's in, and how distraught he is, how much he's lost, and so they are so dismayed and shocked. It says they just sit down and they do nothing for 7 days. They don't speak a word. They just sit with him, and that's called sitting Shiva, which means sitting sevens. And that's a practice in Jewish custom still to this day, where to those devout Jews today, if someone is in mourning, you'll go in and sit with them for a week, and it's not about speaking, not about saying anything. You're just there with them. And we see, and you may have heard me say it before. This was all good. They sat there for those 7 days, and everything was good until Job finally broke the silence and started to speak. And when he does, he says some things. He says, he kind of mourns the day he was even born. Why was I even born? In his eyes, and think about what all he's lost and what's happened to him. He says, wouldn't it have been better if I'd just never been born? Because then my kids wouldn't have been born. They wouldn't have had to die like that. All this stuff wouldn't have happened. But you think about what he's went through, and don't we, at times we lash out. And you can imagine the depression and the woe that he is in at this point. But and he's kind of venting. He's just kind of letting it out there. And then his buddies start to talk. They hear him go on for a little bit, and they start to give their advice. And we know that's when their goodness stops. It was good for them to come. And there's so much to be said when someone is hurting or has suffered or suffering grief, that someone show up and just be there in presence. Just have your presence there. It's not necessary to speak. Just that you're there and say, I'm here. I'm praying for you, and I'll be here if you need me. There's probably no better advice that you could have for someone that is really hurting and is mourning than that right there. Just being this, it's a ministry of presence. Really, that is a great thing. So they hear him, they listen to him for a little bit, and then they start giving advice. And this is when it goes downhill. And what we're going to see in the book of Job is a series of conversations. Basically, these three buddies, and there's a fourth one, a younger one that comes along and adds some advice too, which is no good. But it's just a series of them offering their advice, and then him and Job kind of responding to that a little bit. That's really what happens to the bulk of Job. And I will say this will speak volumes to, if you go in and speaks to cherry picking verses out of the Bible. If you went in the book of Job and found a verse and went, ooh, that sounds good, and you cherry pick that, if it's one of these guys giving their advice, most everything they said is not good advice. So you want to read the whole chapter and make sure what you're saying to people is the right thing. But here, basically, this is the bulk. I wrote down some things. Is when Eliphaz speaks, his buddy, he basically tells him the innocent don't suffer. The innocent don't suffer. And so he's basically saying, your kids, they weren't innocent. You maybe you're not so innocent. Things don't happen like this without a reason. And I will say also that Eliphaz, he tells him, I have a word from the Lord. And I know today, now I have heard this, I hear this a lot. I hear it a lot. And I will say there are times, if you have been in prayer and you feel like God is leading you to do something or to say something to someone, then by all means. But sometimes we throw it around and say, well, the Lord told me, when you say that, we need to make sure that God really is speaking through you. God really has told you to say that good word, or else you just say it. You just say it on you. Don't use God's name unless you feel God has really put it on your heart to say something. Eliphaz says he's got a word from the Lord, and he did not. God just lets him know, I didn't tell you to say this. But he says, the innocent don't suffer. Bildad is, he said, your kids died because of their sin, and they kind of had it coming. That's really to sum up what he says to it. Now imagine how good this would make you feel if you're grieving for the loss of your children and someone tells you this. And Zophar tells Job the suffering is a result of his personal sin. His personal sin. And so, this is really what's called it's called retribution. It's called the idea of retribution. And really, when we think about this, still is going on today. Those same ideas, that same thought is still going on today. And I'll say that because here are some quotes that were given in the hospital that was written down by a pastor. I think Ortberg wrote this down, but this is written by a pastor. It said these are real quotes that were told to people that were in the hospital. And a fellow Christian, had come to visit them. One of them this is a quote, told them that they're in here because of spiritual warfare. If you were standing strong, Satan would be defeated. Isn't that basically saying it's your fault you're sick and in the hospital right now? The next one here is a quote that says, God promises to heal if we have enough faith. God promises to heal if we have enough faith. So the reason you're sick right now is your fault because you don't have enough faith. These are recent quotes. So see, what happened in Job's time is still kind of happening today. And we can accidentally get into this point of saying things like this that we should never say. Job talks about this in chapter 6, verse 14. He talks about true friends and what a true friend is. Let me. Well, I wrote down. Yeah. Job says, to him that is afflicted, pity should be showed from his friend, but he forsaketh the fear of the Almighty. To him that is afflicted, pity should be showed to their friend. We pity them. We're there for them. We're there with them. That's good advice from Job on how a friend should act. And I would say that, even today, we think about in 1 Corinthians 12:26, it says, whether one member suffer, all members suffer with it, or one member be honored, all members rejoice with it. And that's where Paul was talking about the body as being one unit. And basically, if you hurt this leg really bad and you got to walk with a limp, don't you hurt all over? When one part of the body hurts, the rest of the body hurts. And that's kind of what's we should be thinking about here too. Is when someone is suffering, we should suffer with them. The Bible says we do suffer with them. I think about our martyrs today. We have people today halfway around the world that are Christian believers that love the Lord Jesus Christ with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. And there are brothers and sisters, and they are hurting right now halfway around this country. They are in pain. And I think that we have reflexive pain from them. I feel like there are times I can read about martyrs and I hurt inside. Because that's part of the body of us as a whole is hurting. And one of us hurts, we all hurt. And we really see that in the inner church. So when someone in our inner church family here starts hurting, it's just that we're closer to one another, we kind of hurt with them, don't we? I mean, you hear about something and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe, and you just hurt with them. And we see that that's the way we should act. That's the way we should be with our friends. and 2 Corinthians wrote down another one. Blessed be God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted by God. That's the way we should truly handle it. So, toward the end of the book, Job has heard his buddies talk. He's listened to all their advice. He's lashed out a little bit of his own. And finally, what we're going to hear is Job just kind of says, you know what? This really comes down to me and God. This really comes down between me and the Lord. And he says, you know, if he was here, me and him would have a talk. And he starts to kind of take the place of what Satan's been doing. Now Job wants to be the prosecuting attorney. And he kind of starts to get on God a little bit because he doesn't understand. Why is this going on? But this is the question that we all ask as we read through the book of Job. And he says if God was here, me and him would have a talk. And me and him would figure this out. And I think, is that the verse? Job 23, verse 3, oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would order my cause before him and fill my mouth with arguments. That's what Job says there. And so he's taking the case of the prosecuting attorney. He says, oh, that if he was here. Well, guess what? Job gets his chance because now God leaves the upper stage, comes to the lower stage, and presents himself in a storm. He speaks out of the storm to Job. And then he just starts to hit him with about 4 chapters of questions. Job, where were you when I formed the foundations of the earth? Where were you? And he starts to talk to him. And he also starts to talk about the different creation, the ostrich, he talks about this mighty beast, the Leviathan, and some of these things, the unicorn. He says all those different creatures. He talks about the earth and his creation. What we start to see in him is he starts to say, I've created these things, but you also see God's his joy in his creation, his love in his creation. And as he's talking about this creation, it starts to become apparent to Job that he shouldn't have asked what he asked. He starts to figure it out, and he ends up saying here at the end, we know that he says, I've heard of you by the ear, but now I see you. He says, I understand now. I understand that you love and you care for everything. And I understand that even though I don't understand what's going on to me, that I can trust you because you're the creator. And you love your creation and you love me. He understands that the sun rises on evil and good. The rain rains on the just and the unjust. He understands that things happen for a reason. Job figures out that God is just endlessly good. And he says here at Job 42, when he finally speaks back, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel with knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but mine eye now seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. He figures out the truth of this. And he figures out that God is such a great God. It is literally in the character and nature of God to just love us. There's no reason to love the ostrich. It is a goofy little weird bird that runs and flaps its wings and doesn't fly, buries its eggs, and God talks about the ostrich. It buries its eggs and then forgets where they were, just leaves them in the sand. They just hatch. But God loves his creation and he loves that ostrich. And Job starts to see that God is a God of love and that he does love him. And what we're going to see in the end of the book of Job is Job starts to become more like God. He starts to model that love. What the real answer in the end of this, we think in the beginning part of this, that this whole story of Job is God on trial. Are you really a loving God in a world like this? But really that's not the case. Really what's going on here, the devil has put you and I on trial. Job has been chosen as our representative by God to represent the human race. And really who's on trial here is the human race, because the devil is saying, you can't really love God. This whole idea of covenant love, that man will just love you, God, because, just because, it's not true. It won't happen. And God says, yeah, it does. Because God says, I created man and I put my love in his heart. And so all men and women have the capability to love selflessly, to love sacrificially, just because. The same reason God loves, just because He loves us. He's chosen to do so, and it's a part of His very character and nature, and we've been created in that same likeness and image, and because of that, we have the ability to do that too. Just like I spoke about recently, we read of the martyrs who were burned to death singing hymns to God in joy, because they were going to be with God, and they were able to do that. And so really in the end of this, what happens is the devil figures out he was wrong. The devil is proven wrong in this. And that covenant love that we have with God is true. And us humans do have that. And God has that for us in the same. So Satan was wrong. He was wrong about us. And he was wrong about God. And so anyways, that's about it for the book of Job, to be honest with you. That's the way it is. And we know that in the end, he ends up getting blessed by God. Again, he gets all this stuff back. He gets possessions are greater. And no, that's not a part of it. We don't get a reward if we're good and we trust God. Really, that's not what this is about. God just chooses to do this, out of His goodness. And so Job ends up with great blessing, great possessions again. He ends up with 7 sons and those 3 daughters, again, the same amount. And what's neat about the end of it is Job talks a whole lot about his daughters and how beautiful they were. There was no ladies more beautiful than Job's 3 daughters in all the East. And he names them by name, but we don't know the names of his sons. Very odd in Hebrew literature, and in this Middle Eastern society, it's always about the guy and the boys. Remember, they get the blessing because they got to take care of the family. We see where Job gives inheritance to his 3 daughters. He's just his character and nature is turning more like God, and we see him becoming more loving and that sort of thing there at the very end of the book of Job too. And so, anyways, it's a wonderful book. Considered a book of poetry, just the way it's written. But I think this is just the best way I've ever seen to look at it and to know as we're looking at that story. We're getting to see both stages, and we know what's going on, but these guys don't know at the time. And it's just a neat way to look at it. So that's the book of Job. All right. So now let me carry on with Joseph. So Joseph, if we go back to the patriarchs, Joseph. He's the most, literally there's more dedicated to Joseph in the book of Genesis than anyone else. And Joseph is a great model of Christ. What a great character Joseph is. He is so unique. This is in some of your handouts, and I gave out way too many handouts, and I apologize. And it's hard for me to keep track of all them. But so we're going to this is kind of just a brief overview real quick, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. But before I delve into that, let me do some background. Jacob had met Esau. That's where we left off last time. Jacob and Esau met up. They had that great embrace, hug, kiss. Sounded like the prodigal son come home. He thought Esau was going to kill him with his 400 men. Jacob did. Got his name changed to Israel. All that had taken place. Esau and Jacob are really big. They both have been blessed by God. They kind of separate one another because their possessions are so great. Their flocks and herds can't be around each other, kind of like Abraham and Lot's were. And we see Jacob move off. And Jacob goes over near to the city of Shechem, and there in Canaan land, and he sets up shop there. And the first story we're going to hear about as we go on, and this is found in Genesis 34, is Jacob had one daughter, named Dinah. Dinah came from Leah. Remember that he had the two concubines as well. Bilhah was Rachel's, and then Zohar, was that her name? Zilpah was her name. The other one's concubine's name. But Dinah was the eldest daughter of Laban. Remember, he wanted Rachel and ended up 7 years, and Laban slipped in his older daughter Leah. Dinah is the daughter of Leah, the one daughter that Jacob had. This is interesting, and let me point this out in chapter 34. It says there's this brief story where Dinah, it says, went out to see the women of the land when they moved to Shechem. There's a lot can be said of that verse, those few words right there, and what we see later on, and kind of as we put this story together. She went out out to see the women of the land. She was a young girl, considered a damsel, it says. So she was young. She went out to see these women of the land. Who were the women of the land? The women of the land were not good ladies. And this would have been party time. This would have been going out to people that worshipped idols, all kinds of bad things going on. And when she was out there hanging with the ladies of the land, this prince from Shechem got a hold of her and ended up laying with her, which humiliated her. We didn't come to her father and ask permission. She shouldn't have been in this place, but this, even though she shouldn't have been there, this should have never happened. This man did something he should not have done. But he did love her. Who knows whether she loved him or not? We don't know. Doesn't matter. Today we look at this, and because of movies and just our society in general, this doesn't seem like that big of a deal. This was a big deal. Premarital sex, that sort of thing, doesn't happen. It should never have happened. And it brings disgrace to the family. Jacob found out, didn't deal with it right away. But when his adult sons get home from tending the sheep, Leah's two other sons that she had, they were the direct brother and sister, same mom and dad as Dinah. They were not pleased. That would be Simeon and Levi. When they got home and found out their little sister that this had happened, don't care whether she loves him or not. This was a disgrace, a humiliation to the family, and they weren't going to have no part of it. But Shechem, this prince, he really does love her. For no matter how the story goes, he really does love Dinah and wants to marry her. And he sends his dad. He asks his dad. It sounds like Samson. He says, verse 4, "Get me this girl for my wife." He tells his dad, the king. So that sounds like Samson said this, something just like that. And they come down and talk to Jacob and the sons, and they say, these two want to be married. It needs to happen, and we want you to marry into our family. We'll marry into yours. We'll all be one big. You can live here. We can have land together. It'd be great. And what ends up happening is these two older brothers of Dinah slip around back and tell this guy, "Okay, we'll do that. We're going to do that. We've talked about it, and we're going to do it. But here's the thing: for us to marry in with one another, we worship the one true God, and there's this whole covenant thing we've got with God, and the mark of the covenant is circumcision." So if you guys, the only way we can marry into your family, and your wives, and your girls can marry into our guys and all that, is to take on this covenant. So if you will circumcise yourselves, then we'll do this, and we'll have a great. It's just going to be us. We're going to marry. It's going to be awesome. And of course, they were tricking them. And these guys said, whatever it takes. They circumcise themselves, and 3 days later, circumcision with a flint knife. And infection, whether it was infection or not, it just would not be good. And 3 days later, when they were at the height of their pain and from doing the circumcision, here comes Simeon and Levi with probably their servants, I guess, as well, or whatever, and they invade this town and kill every man in it. They take revenge. You messed with our little sister, and they take it out. They kill them, and to kill all the males. When Jacob finds out about this, he says, "What have you guys done?" Because we're just a small family in this area. The Shechem and that town and that king and that prince, they know everybody around here. The Hittites, the Hivites, everybody knows them. The Pezerites, we're going to be in trouble. And probably they would have been. God tells Jacob, you need to get back, go back to Bethel, get out of here for a while. And then God puts a terror on the people of the land. So they would have come after him had God not intervened on their behalf, on Jacob's behalf. And so they go back to Bethel. Remember the place where he laid on the rock? His head on the rock, that place where God was there. And they anointed the rock. God tells him to go back there. In that whole trip of that happening, a couple of things happen. One is Rachel, the wife whom Jacob loved. He worked the 7 years, and they seemed as if a day to him because of his love for Rachel. He loved her so much. That's his special, unique love. He thought she's about it. She goes into labor with their second son. She's given birth to Joseph already. She goes into labor again, and it's hard labor, and she actually dies giving birth to this next son on the way back. And so this son, she says to call him Benoni, And Benoni, that means son of my sorrow, I believe. Son of sorrow is what Benoni means. Jacob, as soon as he takes the baby, he renames the baby Benjamin. Benjamin means son of my right hand. And I will say that you're going to see that a lot in the Psalms. Have you heard that? My right hand, the strength of his right hand. Right hand means a place of preeminence, a place of honor, and it also means power. And so think of where Christ is at. When Stephen looked up into heaven when he was being martyred, where was Christ? He's on the right hand of the Father. The right hand. The right hand is that place of power and the place of honor. And you'll see that all through Psalms, talking about the right hand of God. And it's talking about God's power when it talks about it, or it's talking about honor. Well, anyways, Benjamin is born, but Rachel dies. And so now we're going to get going here with this young man here, Joseph. Joseph was the firstborn son of Rachel before she died, giving birth to Benjamin. The favorite son, here it is, the favorite son of Jacob, born to his beloved wife Rachel. How was Joseph mistreated, hated by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, wrongfully imprisoned, forgotten? You don't have to write all this down if you don't want to, but the highlights if you want you can, but that's just there if you would like to. Which I did teach this, to high school students, and I have quizzes, I have tests, I have everything. If you guys want to take those, we could start doing. I have homework assignments. We could start doing all this. They were not for that this morning at all when I told them that. But Brindley takes a test after we're done, every morning when she's here. And but anyways, so this is where we're at. Who was Joseph's sons? Manasseh and Ephraim. That's kind of the background of it. We'll get into this a little bit here. We know Joseph. That was a favored son of Jacob because that was the firstborn son of his wife that he loved so much, Rachel. And he did show partiality to him. But Joseph, as a young man, sounds a little bit spoiled, I don't know. Talks about he was out in the field. He's out there in the field with, when he was 17 years old, the Bible says he's out in the field with his brothers. He was with Bilhah and Zilpah's sons, which that'd be Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher. He's out with them, and he comes back after being out in the field with them, and the Bible says he gives a bad report of them to his dad. So evidently they weren't holding their weight, or they were goofing off, whatever it might have been. He gives a bad report. He's given this coat of many colors. That coat really represents and seems to represent a blessing. And so the other brothers are already not real happy with this kid because Dad's showing partiality to him, and that coat of many colors might mean that he's going to be the one that gets the blessing. And why would this young kid get the blessing? But so that wasn't going the best for him. And of course, there is a couple reasons why they hated him, favored by their father. There it is right there. I actually put it up there, I guess. So we see here early on he has those two dreams, those dreams, and that didn't help him either anyways. It's kind of sometimes you're like, Joseph, did you really have to share that? But he had those vision, a dream, and the first dream there he dreams about that they're out and the sheaves. This is fall, so there's a lot of our decorations to stand up the corn stalks and wrap the rope around the middle. They used to do that to let them dry better and all. So that's what his dream's about, those sheaves. And he says, they were laying on the ground, but his sheaves stood up. And their sheaves, there was these other sheaves that represented all of the brothers. So the other 11 sheaves bowed down to his sheaf. And he tells them that. And they don't think that's too cool. They're saying, what, so we're going to bow to you someday? Is that who you are? And then he dreams this other dream. And this other dream, it's the sun and the moon and 11 stars that bow down to him. And that one takes in mom and dad, virtually is what we're thinking there. And it says his brothers were very jealous of him, and his dad kind of reprimanded him. But also I will note that his dad, there's an end of verse 11 there in chapter 37, his dad kept this saying to himself. His dad reprimanded, but he kept that saying to himself. Doesn't that remind you of Luke chapter 2? Remember when Mary and the angels showed up and she just had to give birth to that son, and the shepherds said, this is what the angels done, what they said, and it said, and Mary says she kept that to herself. She kept that in her heart. Kind of seems similar there, I think, those two things when I read that. But he has those dreams. The guys, we're not pleased with this. And one day, Joseph, the story, Joseph is sent out to look for his brothers. And he went looking for him, and you got to imagine, if you've seen pictures of Israel, it doesn't look like Missouri. And so, we've got a lot of herds and flocks. We got to keep moving, looking for sustenance, looking for fields, looking for grass and things to eat. And so sometimes they say that when he says go go looking for your brothers to check on them, they might be 2 or 3 days away. And but he went looking for them, found a guy, said, "Have you seen my brothers?" They said, "Last I saw them went towards Dothan." But as they seen him coming, they said, "Here comes the dreamer." And they begin to plot here. And Reuben, when he heard it, he kind of rescues the idea. He kind of rescues his brother out of it because they were wanting to kill him. Reuben kind of starts turning their thoughts away from that. And I will tell you why. It's because if we went back just a little ways back, we're going to see that Reuben done something really stupid. Reuben is the oldest son of Leah. He's actually the firstborn son of Jacob, the very first one. And we don't know how old Bilhah and Zilpah were, but anyways, Reuben actually lays with Bilhah at one point. And that was his father's concubine. That was a huge no-no, and Jacob had found out about it. Jacob doesn't say much. Jacob's going to say much later on. But right now, nothing much happens. We know Reuben probably knows that. And Reuben, you think, what a great guy here. But Reuben says he tried to rescue him out of their hands. And he does say, let's not take his life and not shed blood today and all of that. But there's a verse in there down about 22 or so that where at the end of it kind of hints at saying that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. And then later on, when you read over here, this says in verse 29-30, he returns to get Joseph, and he's not there, and he says something along the lines of, "Now what's going to happen to me? What's going to become of me?" Because in his mind, I think he's thinking, if I could do this whole rescue thing and bring that back to Dad, I would get back into favor with Dad because of the stupid thing I did with his concubine. But anyways, what happens? They throw Joseph in a hole. Some Ishmaelite guys come by. They're on their way to Egypt, and they sell him. And so Judah kind of helps try to do some of this too. Judah does some good things here too, but Judah does some really dumb things as well. We just haven't got into those. But that's what I said. The hero of the story is always God. And I love the way the Bible shows the truth of man. These guys, none of them you think, oh, that's going to be my hero. He doesn't try to be a hero. He does something dumb. But God is the one who comes through, and then God's the one that always is the one that we can look to as our hero and trust in. So they take the robe back, they pour goat's blood on it, take it back to Jacob, tell him that Joseph's been chewed up by an animal, and he is in horrible pain over that. We know Joseph goes on to live and being sold into bondage in Egypt. Potiphar is the captain of the guard who buys him and who has him in his home. Joseph he's one of those guys, he makes the best of a bad situation, so he gets dealt the lemons and he makes lemonades, and God blesses him. God, and what we see in Joseph is this wonderful, great integrity and work ethic. Kind of like Colossians 3:23, whatever he does it as if working for the Lord and not for men. And so even in this bad situation, he works his job well, and Potiphar just starts to promote him because everything that this Joseph does, it seems to be blessed, and he excels at everything, and pretty soon Potiphar just puts him in charge of the whole house. And Potiphar doesn't have to worry about a thing because Joseph does such great work and does such a good job. But then there's somebody else that notices that, and not just notices his work ethic, but his bulging biceps, evidently. Potiphar's wife says that he was handsome in appearance, and she decides she wants to have some extracurricular activity with him. But he knows better, and I preached that recently, talked about that fact. When she tries to sway Joseph into laying with her, he says, your husband has been so good to me as my boss. He respects me, he does everything for me, and he says, I can do anything I want, I can have anything I want in the house except for you. And he says, so why would I do this? And more so, why would I ever even consider this wickedness before my God? So his answer is a big oh no, it ain't going to happen. And she continues to try, and one day when no one's around, she grabs hold of him. Remember, he flees evil. He flees her as fast as he can, and in fact leaves his garment behind, his jacket behind. She cries foul, says he tried to have his way with me. and we know that he ends up in jail because of it. And so Joseph ends up in the pokey. Am I behind on this? I am, ain't I? Yeah, I'm way behind. Sorry about that. Oops, I'm too far. So he ends up in jail, and so here he goes. He ends up in jail for the wrong reasons. And what happens when he's in jail? Same thing. Colossians 3:23. He works at it as if working for the Lord and not for men. He takes this bad situation he's been dealt, and he just puts his head down and goes about working. And pretty soon the guy who runs the prison says, man, this guy's all right. Puts him in charge of everything, and he's reaping the benefits. He don't have to do his job, and he's getting all the accolades because the prison is running like clockwork. And here's Joseph doing so good again. And then what we're going to see is that there's you know the story, the cupbearer or the butler, the butler and the chef that are the royal chef and the royal butler end up in the pokey as well. They do something to upset Pharaoh, and they end up in the pen with Joseph, and he's in charge of them. He's in charge of everyone, and he notices that they're just downtrodden one day. These two men of royalty are down and out, and he asks them about it, and both of them had told him they had this dream. They've had a dream, and they just can't figure it out. And so he asked him what was the dream, and the butler first, or the cupbearer, everyone look at it, the translations there, but the butler would say, well, I had a dream that there was a vine, and that vine it just grew out, and fast forward, it blossomed all of a sudden, and then from the blossom come the grape, and then I reached up and picked the grape and squeezed it into the cup and handed it to Pharaoh, and he drank. He said, I just don't understand though what it was about. There was 3 buds that popped up, 3 grapes that popped up on this and happened. And he says, I can't figure it out. Well, so we see that Joseph says, well, that represents 3 days. And in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to lift up your head and anoint you, bring you back into his presence, and you'll be giving him that cup of wine as his butler again one day. Well, we know that the chef, the baker, he hears the same thing, and he says, man, I had a dream, and since that sounded so good, let me tell you about my dream. And he says that there was... he has these cake baskets on his head, and there was 3 of them there, and this whatever happens, he says there's baked food, and but then these birds come along, start eating the food. I don't know what it means, and he says, well, it's the same as his, and the 3 means 3 days, and in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to lift up your head from your body. He's going to remove your head, and you are going to die, and then the birds are going to eat of your flesh. So he went, oh, that's great. And so he tells him, he says, now y'all remember me, or he tells the butler, remember me when you're taken back and this all comes true. And we know that exact thing came true, but then the Bible says the cupbearer or the butler forgot about Joseph and never mentioned him. So Joseph stays in prison. He stays in prison He stays in prison another 2 years. Stuck in prison another 2 years. Until one day Pharaoh has a dream or two, and Pharaoh is really bothered by these dreams. They're very vivid, and he woke up after the first dream, and he was bothered by it, and he goes back to sleep, and then he has a second dream that was very similar to the first, and so he calls together his magicians, his priests, and everybody he can find, says, somebody tell me what this means, and none of them can figure it out. And then the cupbearer, the butler, remembers. He says, there was this young Hebrew in prison when I was in prison. So they bring him up. They bring Joseph out of prison, clean him up, shave him, and bring him before Pharaoh. And he says, I heard that you can tell me a dream, that you can describe dreams to a T. And he says, nope, I can't do it. He says, but God can. And we notice that's exactly what he does. He gives God all the credit. He says, I can't do anything, but God can show you the dream through me. And that's how Daniel described it too. Daniel later on, Nebuchadnezzar says, you can tell dreams. He says, no, I can't, but God can. And so, but we'll see Joseph here. He says, what was the dream? And he tells him about these 7 cows. The Pharaoh himself dreamed these 7 cows come out of the Nile River and come up onto the land and start to eat in the meadow. And they're the most gorgeous, beautiful cows you've ever seen, healthy, strong. 7 of them. And then suddenly there's 7 more cows come out from the Nile as well. And they're gangly, sickly looking. You can see every bone in their body. They look like they're about to keel over. And they come up, and those 7 old, nasty-looking cows eat the healthy cows. They literally eat them. But after they're done eating them, he says, but you can't tell it because they still look just as sickly and nasty as they ever did. And he said, and I woke up from that, and then I went to sleep and had another dream. And this one was of ears of corn. He said, the 7 ears grew on the same corn stalk, and they were the most perfect, beautiful corn you ever seen. And he said, and then suddenly below them, here comes 7 new ones that sprout up below them and consume, just grow over the good ones. And it's rotted, nasty, flies buzzing around. Nobody would eat it. It was horrible. What does it mean? And Joseph says, okay, God gave you 2 dreams. That means it's very important and it's coming quickly. And what it means is, he says, they really mean the same thing. And that is that we're going to have 7 years of abundance. There's going to be abundance, growth, crops. Everything's going to be fantastic for the next 7 years. But then there's going to be 7 years of famine. And then Joseph, what's he been doing lately? In Potiphar's house, in the prison. He's kind of a leader. He's pretty good at it. And so he goes on, while he's got Pharaoh's attention, he says, by the way, what you probably need to do is find somebody that's got a lot of wisdom and put them in place to kind of, steer this and make sure that you're storing away some food over these 7 years. Make sure you do it right, and so you'll have plenty for those 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh looks at him and says, hey, who could be better than you? You actually hear from God. And you seem to know what you're doing. So he makes him the viceroy of Egypt, second in command. He said, gives him his signet ring, puts the robes on him and all that, and says, no one will lift up a foot in this place unless Joseph says for them to be able to. So he is made the number 2 man in all of Egypt. And of course, my goodness, I am really going to pick this up. Whoops. I did the same thing this morning. So Pharaoh puts him as second in charge, and we know he goes to work right away, making things happen. So 2 years of famine are hit, and after the years of plenty, and Jacob, all the way up into Canaan, this famine extends all the way up into Canaan, and Jacob and his house ends up with no food. But Jacob hears that they have food in abundance in Egypt. So he sends his boys down to Egypt to get food, all except for Benjamin. That's his pride and joy. He's not taking chances with Benjamin. He doesn't lost his brother. So he keeps Benjamin. He sends the other kids down, which are not kids anymore. These are adult men. But he sends them down to Egypt to get food. When they show up, here is the number 2 man in all of Egypt standing there, the man that has done it all, the one in control. They run into Joseph. Now you can imagine, Joseph is 30-some years old now, just over 30 years old. When they tossed him in the pit and sold him into slavery to Egypt, he was 17. So a lot of time has passed here. Think about, he's learned the language. He now looks like a prince. They have, put the Egyptian look on them. How he looks. He speaks the language. He would look way different. Think of yourself at 17 versus when you're like 32. How much we change. We do change a lot. And then think of the dress and all that. And so they come in before him. You know what the first thing they do is when they come in before Joseph? They bow to the ground. All the brothers bow down to him. They don't know who he is. They don't know. But Joseph knows who they are. They were much older than him. He recognized they haven't changed as much. And they come there and they say they're here to get food. But Joseph's going to mess with them a little bit. Can't blame him. And so they start talking about things, and they don't know that he can understand them because he speaks Hebrew, and they don't know that he can understand what he's saying. But he tells them, he says, who are you, where are you from? And he accuses them of being spies. He said, you're spies, coming to spy out the nakedness of the land. You're here to try to destroy Egypt. And they're like, no, we're not. We're just lowly men. Our dad's back home. And they describe the whole thing. He asks them a few questions, and they mention having another brother. And he says, all right, I'll tell you what. To prove you're not spies, I want you to, one of you is going to stay here. The rest of you go back and get this mysterious little brother of yours and bring him back down. And Joseph wanted to see his brother. This is the true brother, right, that Rachel had. So same mom, same dad. And we know either he was not born yet or he was itty-bitty when Joseph was taken into slavery. And chances are he may not have ever seen him before. Maybe he wasn't born yet. But anyways, this is the thing. So what he does, he takes all the brothers, accuses them of being spies, puts them all in confinement for 3 days. And says, you think about who's going to stay here. And then after that, he comes to him 3 days later and says, all right, and he chooses Simeon. I'm keeping Simeon here. The rest of you going back. He said, but don't come back here again to get Simeon. Don't come back here for food or anything unless you bring that little brother with you that you supposedly have. And so they leave, go back, and when they tell Jacob this story, Jacob is very distraught. Not so much over Simeon. I think he's like, you know what, he can stay. But I'm not sending Benjamin. And he tells them, we're not doing it. He just will not do this. And so eventually the food runs out. And not until the food runs out does Jacob finally give in and say, okay, take Benjamin and go back down there and get Simeon and get us some food. When he goes back down there, we know that, and I will say this, when he sent them back, he put their money that they paid for back in their sacks of food. So they got back, they kind of freaked out about that. They were like, oh my goodness, they're going to think we stole this now. But they go back, they go back there and they bring Benjamin with them. And when they come back, Joseph sees them, brings them into his house. He has to excuse himself. He cries. He just can't believe he sees Benjamin. He comes back, composes himself, comes back out, has them all sit down for a meal, and he treats them to a meal at his very table. And it was kind of neat. At one point, he gives all of them a ration of food, but he gives Benjamin 5 rations, 5 portions extra. I think he's testing them to see as well, are they going to treat my little brother like they did me? You know, he's the youngest. He's probably, Dad's partial to him too. I want to see how they treat my little brother. So he gave him 5 portions of food. Everybody else just 1. But he's seen some good things that seemingly out of them. But he tells them when they get ready to leave to go. He acts like everything's cool. He tells them that he fills up their sacks of food. But remember this: he tells one of his guards to sneak his very silver chalice, his silver cup, in Benjamin's bag, hide it in there. And they do that. And then once they leave, he sends his guards after him. And they say, one of you has stolen my Lord's silver cup. And they said, oh, we would have never done that. And they said, if one of us has done that, that person can be your slave for life or kill them, whatever. And they said, okay, be it on what you just said. If we find it, we're going to take him as a prisoner or take him back. And they found it in Benjamin's sack. Okay, these guys are losing their mind now. And so they're like, oh my goodness, and they say, surely God is punishing us for what we did to Joseph. This is what this must be about. They come back. When they get back, they start appealing to Joseph, and Judah just spills it all. He tells them, what we did years ago. We're paying for this now. I know it's our fault. And Joseph he breaks down. He can't take it anymore, and he tells them who he is. He tells them in tears, and they hug it out. He asks him, how's Dad doing, all that. Let's go back and get him. And so they send back and get Dad and tell him Joseph is still alive, and they bring him back with them. So everything is going to work out great here. It was like winning the lottery for them, you can imagine. He brings them back and puts them in the land of Goshen, which is the most fertile land. They're all shepherds, and this land is just plush, near the Nile River. It's wonderful. But they meet the Pharaoh. Joseph's dad, Jacob, gets to meet Pharaoh, and he says, anybody that is a father to this man is royalty to me, basically, is what he treats him like. And so he brings him back there, and then we're going to see, as he gets back, there's still some things that have to happen because only 2 years we're 2 years deep in the famine, a little over. And so he brings 70 total of the family. So all of Israel, all of Jacob, his family moves to the land of Goshen. So this is where it's going to happen. Remember how Exodus is going to play out. This is when they all come to the land of Egypt. And they're blessed in Goshen. The Pharaoh loves them. Everything's great. And they're there, and they begin to multiply, of course. But there's 70 that moved there that first time. But this famine's still going on, and we see how Joseph kind of handles it here. Basically, what happens is this famine extends all the way up through Canaan, all this area around. You can figure a radius around there. People come to buy what he had saved up, because he'd built storehouses and saved the food. They spend every dime they have. So nobody has money anymore. They pay everything they have to Egypt. So now Egypt has all the money. And so then the people come to him and say, we're still hungry. What do we do? And he says, okay, bring me your livestock. And so they bring him everything that they own, every kind of animal, every livestock that they have. Then they have nothing left. They're still hungry. He says, okay, I'll take your land. So then now Egypt has all the land. And so through Joseph, look at what he's done again. Now Egypt becomes super wealthy, super rich, and is gained through all of this. And the people there at the end, they come to him and say, okay, we'll just be your slaves. But Joseph says, no, here's what we're going to do. He hands back their land and says, but going forward, what we want is I want you to pay a fifth, 20% of everything from now on. I'm going to give you seed to plant, and we're going to try to make a go of this, but 20% of what you make from now on comes back to Pharaoh. So when he does this, we're talking about the first national income tax ever created. Joseph did, and the people loved him for it, because they're like, we could have been your slaves, but instead you've given us back land that we gave to you, and you give us seed to plant. All we got to do is give you back 20% of it. Great. So everybody's happy, and Joseph has made Pharaoh in Egypt such a wealthy nation and loved because of this. Lastly, and I'm not going through, I'm sorry. Now, man, I am really far behind. The last thing on here is Jacob is get to the point where he's going to die in the land of Egypt, and he asked that his bones be taken back to that cave. Remember where Abraham was buried and Sarah? Take me back to where my fathers and all that was buried. So he asked them to do that, and then he blesses. He's got to pass on that blessing at death. And so he does that very thing. The one thing he does is he tells Joseph, he lost Joseph for all those years, the son that he loved. So what he does for Joseph is he says, I'm going to take your two sons, Joseph, and I'm going to bless them. I'm like adopting them, and they'll be blessed as if they were my sons. And so Joseph, there is no tribe of Joseph. What we have instead is a tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh, which are Joseph's two sons. And so Jacob takes them as his own children in order to give them the blessing. And it's also unique that Manasseh was the firstborn. And so he should have got the main blessing. But remember what happened with Jacob and Esau and how the first and the last thing? When he gets ready to bless them, he takes his right hand, and the Bible says he crosses his hand on the two boys. And Joseph says, oh no, wait a minute, Dad. Manasseh is actually the oldest. And Jacob says, I know. And he blesses Ephraim as the firstborn of those two. And he says Ephraim will be a great nation. And actually Ephraim does become a huge nation. And Ephraim, sometimes just to be confusing, when you refer to like the northern kingdom of Israel, they'll call it Ephraim. So a lot of times, instead of using the name Israel, they'll say Ephraim, because Ephraim as a tribe got so big. It was almost lopsided. They were so blessed. But anyways, then he comes down the blessing, right, for his sons. Jacob comes to, guess what? Reuben, his firstborn. And he says, the blessing goes like this. He says, you assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed and defiled it. And so he does not get that blessing that he thought he was going to get. And I think he knew he was in trouble. But see, it came back in the end to bite him. And remember Simeon and Levi, the two oldest of Leah, they came next. But remember, they are the ones that did the whole circumcision, killing the guy's thing. He said, he called them brothers, weapons of violence. And he said, let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. And he says, for in their anger they killed men. They hamstringed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath is cruel. And so he's pretty hard on them too. And then he goes down, and of course, does Judah. Judah did some really dumb things, a couple things I didn't even mention that we passed over. But, who comes from the tribe of Judah? Jesus does, and King David does. It's really got a great name, but they don't always do things right. None of these guys ever do. But it goes through, then he gives all these blessings to all the different ones. And then, of course, he dies. And, Benjamin, that's where King Saul and Paul came from. That was their tribe. But he dies, and they take him back to that cave. And when they do, Pharaoh sends like half the army back with him, wagons, a great procession. It says the people of the land of Canaan saw it coming through, and they were like, wow. And they mentioned this must be some great person of Egypt that has died. It seems that all of Egypt is wailing over this person, whoever it was. And it was Jacob that had died. And so they took him back to his cave. Joseph, in his the men thought after that, they said, now they were afraid that after Dad died, now, kind of remember how Esau was going to kill Jacob originally, and when Dad died, these boys get worried about Joseph. Now they're like, now Dad's died, maybe he'll come back on us. And he ends up telling them that great thing in the end. They even told him, they said, hey, Dad was kind of like hoping you wouldn't kill us after he died. They even tell him that, and he tells them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. You know, he tells them, you did not send me to Egypt, God sent me to Egypt. And he says to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. He tells them, don't fear. He says, I don't have that anger. It's not you, it's God that's done this, and He done it for a reason. And that's why I'm here, and I'm not going to harm you. And then, of course, Joseph, the day he dies, he had asked his family and those below him to take his body out of Egypt. Don't leave him here either. He wanted to go back into the land of Canaan. So I got really far behind on this. Sorry. That would be in the book of Genesis. And I'm a little bit over time here because I went long, sorry. I don't know if you want these answers or not. Yeah. Jacob sends his 10 sons to Egypt food. Now the younger people in high school, and my kids done this, even though they weren't allowed to have cell phones when I taught this. And they weren't supposed to have cell phones go, but all the kids, that's what they do. They take pictures. They just take out their cell phone and go, click, for notes. I'm like, wish I'd had that when I was in school. That's a great idea.